Well, thank you, Alad, Inform and CRPL for inviting me to speak today. Very pleased to be with you and to be hearing the other speakers as well. It's really great that you're doing this, and it's wonderful. I can see that we're connecting people from around the world, so I think that's one of the real benefits of the online mode. And indeed, that's something that I do with Linda Dubrow-Marshall. We co-run the online Masters in the Psychology of Coercive Control program at the University of Salford. And for full disclosure, I also sit on the International Cultic Studies Association Board of Directors and chair their research network and committee. If you're interested in our monthly research network seminars on Fridays, then please do get in touch, where we discuss all types of research about coercive control and cults, and lots more besides. And I'm going to be making the case today that coercive control, that is, as we'll see in a moment, defined mainly and originally with regard to intimate relationships, applies also to groups and contexts of different kinds, including in religious organizations and groups. And indeed, I'm making the case today that coercive control does unfortunately exist in some modern or new religions, and that this is as a result both of belief systems and actions and the interrelationship between the two. So I want to start by just running through what coercive control is and how it's defined. I'll be making the case then for how that goes across contexts as well. And it's been recognised for some time now as having a devastating effect on individuals. And there's been a criminal offence in England and Wales. It's the separate laws in Scotland and Northern Ireland now as well. But back in 2015, the Serious Crime Act criminalised coercive control or controlling and coercive behaviour, and stated that it could be just psychological. So psychological abuse can be enough for somebody to be prosecuted and convicted of the offence of controlling a coercive behaviour. And indeed, we've seen cases of that around the country. So very quickly, this is the definition of controlling behaviour and also coercive behaviour. I won't read these out, but just as either a reminder, or if you're seeing this for the first time, that this is about a pattern of activity that deprives people of their ability to act independently, to access resources in the normal way, and it can take place on a continuing basis. Often it's not single events. This applies a lot of the time to domestic abuse, where historically the focus was on individual incidents, physical incidents, whereas coercive control very clearly is a pattern, mainly of psychological abuse, but it can include physical abuse over a period of time. So as I say, it doesn't relate to a single incident. It relates to a purposeful pattern of behaviour over time, where power is exerted, control or coercion of one person over another. And these are some examples in the statutory guidance from 2015 around isolating a person from their friends and family, depriving them of their needs, monitoring their time, monitoring their online communication, and so on. Taking control really of every aspect of their life on a day-to-day basis, including access to, for example, medical services, but also humiliation, repeatedly putting the person down. And one interesting part is forcing the victim to take part in criminal activity. So there are lots of examples of people being involved in shoplifting, or indeed the neglect or abuse of children, as it says there. And threats and humiliation run throughout these definitions, as do more serious forms of criminal activity, such as assault, criminal damage, rape, and other forms of sexual abuse. In the Serious Crime Act, you have interchangeability between different sections. So some of these examples would also appear in other sections of the Act. And the point is that any one of these items can be devastating and long-lasting, when I'll come back to the effects of that a little later on. And this led in 2021 to a statutory definition of domestic abuse. And the bits in bold are particularly noteworthy here. The coercive control definition continued, but it was expanded to wider family members. That can include adult abuse, child and parent abuse, etc., but also the wider family networks that exist. That can therefore brings in things such as honor-based abuse, for example. But these definitions overall of controlling coercive behaviour in UK law is mainly focused on relationships and families. And yet, if we actually think about the way that this operates and we look at the research that's been done, we can see that coercive control actually, under different terminology and definitions, actually operates in group settings and environments as well. So if we look at Robert J. Lifton's seminal work on thought reform in social movements, political movements, religious movements, we can see a high degree of similarity, for example, with milieu control and coercive control, that control of the person's hour by hour, day to day activity, the way that people are coerced into confessing their sins or confessing that they're not good enough, the demands for adherence to the belief system, the way people can be manipulated mystically or spiritually, I'll come back to. But the notion that the person's agency and identity is effectively taken over in this group setting as a consequence of thought reform has been well established in the literature for many years. And you can immediately see that this is, in a sense, a definition of coercive control that has been defined within a group as opposed to a relational context. And you can say the same here for Biderman's framework of coercion. Sorry for the slightly blurry slide. This was published a long time ago. But these methods of coercion, whether isolation, monopolization of the person's perception, what Biderman called inducibility and exhaustion threats, again, you can see again these similarities and overlaps with the definitions of controlling coercive behavior in relationships and families. And also, indeed, the definition of thought reform that I've just had there from Robert J. Lifton, the way in which the person is essentially forced by somebody in a more powerful position to do their bidding, at great sacrifice to themselves. And if you think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the way in which their needs are reduced down, such that a lot of the time they're operating, as it says there, at the animal level. So in other words, they're not self-actualized, they don't have agency in the normal way. And it's interesting that the UK law also has the Modern Slavery Act of 2015, slavery, servitude, and forced or compulsory labour. And the definitions of this and of human trafficking and modern slavery in different jurisdictions owes a lot to that Biderman work on coercion, and can be seen again to have some important overlaps to the way in which coercive control is defined within families and more broadly. And to complete the trio of laws that was introduced actually in the UK in 2015 by then Home Secretary Theresa May, the Counterterrorism and Security Act 2015, within the Prevent and Channel Guidance, the Vulnerability Assessment Framework, I'll use my cursor here, talks about within radicalized individuals, the intent to cause harm comes from over-identification with a group or ideology, them and us thinking, we're great, everyone else is bad and need to be destroyed. The dehumanization, in other words, of the enemy and a harmful means to an end. And again, this fits very much with what we see in other settings of coercive control. So we have laws actually that cover groups and that cover the movement and trafficking and the enslavement of individuals, as well as coercive control in families and relationships. Not that we shouldn't have a law that applies to groups more broadly. I'll come back to that. But we already have a trio of laws that, in their own way, define coercive control across these different settings. This has allowed us to put this forward, and we've done several versions of these. We like the overlapping circles. The coercive control is a unifying concept that brings together different ways of describing the subjugation of individual agency and identity across different settings, whether it be in domestic abuse or intimate partner violence, modern slavery, radicalization. That notion of thought reform and coercive control can actually be seen to exist across those different settings. And what I'm putting to you today is that included within those settings are religious groups and new religious groups in particular. And what are the effects then? If we have these overlapping terms for coercive control, we also have overlapping effects. And for many years, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, version 5TR, has defined now otherwise specified dissociative disorder as an identity disturbance due to prolonged and intense coercive persuasion. You see in examples in brackets, they include thought reform, as I've talked about there, indoctrination while captive, torture, but also recruitment by sects, cults, or terror organizations. And I would also argue that within that coercive persuasion envelope comes the forms of controlling coercive behavior within abusive relationships as well. So we have overlapping context in which coercive control operates, and therefore overlapping ways to understand the damaging effects of coercive control. And psychological harm from coercion has been extensively documented. There was a wonderful review back in 2001 by Jodie Aronoff and colleagues, and then Rod Dubrow-Marshall and I have published twice in the Encyclopedia of Mental Health, published by Elsevier, doing review articles of extensive documented research, specifically looking there at cults and mental health, with consistent findings of symptoms of dissociation, depression, and anxiety, both from research on different forms of coercive control and also from clinical accounts, often consistent with symptoms of PTSD or complex PTSD, noting that length of exposure isn't necessarily a reliable predictor of the level of harm. In other words, people can actually be in for quite a short time in a coercive environment and can be quite badly harmed. Research that we are currently undertaking with Jilabi Mitten, looking at the relationship between psychological distress and a number of test measures that we've been developing for extensive coercive control, group identity, and also trauma coerced attachment, often known as trauma bonding, has shown a consistent relationship so far between those things. In other words, the more that somebody is involved, the more that they are identified with a coercive environment or person, the more that they are coercively controlled, the higher the levels of psychological harm. Research that I conducted a number of years ago, quite a few years ago now, at the Wellspring Retreat and Resource Centre with Paul Martin, Ron Burks and colleagues, identified that people's identity becomes taken over, a form of totalistic identity in coercive environments of different kinds. And this is what leads then to forms of trauma coerced attachment and complex PTSD. So whether that coercive environment is a relationship, whether it's a group, whether it's modern slavery, we would see that domination of that coercive environment over the individual's identity and over their agency, with deleterious effects on their mental health. So, having established then that coercive control occurs across contexts, let's look specifically at the context of religion. And coercive control then exists in different forms in religion and religious groups of different kinds. So I'm not sitting here and saying that this is a simple thing to diagnose or identify. It's complex. And I acknowledge that it occurs in both older and newer religious groups, but it's been widely acknowledged over the decades. And more recently, the Bloom Review, Does Government Do God?, the independent review into how the government engages with faith. It was published in 2023. I want to pay tribute to Colin Bloom and the colleagues who put the review and did the review. It was kind of a bit overshadowed by Brexit and COVID, like so much else, but within a very extensive review, it did have a focus in one particular section on religious groups exhibiting high demands that prohibit freedom of movement, equivalent to what we would define as forms of trafficking, psychological manipulation to isolate members from wider society, in other words, what would be clearly seen as a form of coercive or milieu control, and to make it difficult for people to leave. And there you get examples of financial dependency or financial abuse. And the Bloom Review went on to say that there are serious consequences when people try and exit groups of this nature, and that there can be a big physical, emotional, and spiritual toll. And it's the spiritual toll I'll be focusing on in some of my remaining time, because there's a particular element to that that makes it additionally damaging to people's identity and their ability to recover moving forward. So the Bloom Review was really useful, and there needs to be more work like that, I think, to actually identify, and I'll come back to this in conclusion, um, the extent to which coercive control is occurring in different religious groups and what can be done about it. I want to briefly touch on definitions of spiritual abuse, and ICSA, which I mentioned earlier, has a great set of resources with regard to this. There's some great research also done here in the UK by Lisa Oakley and colleagues at the University of Chester. And this is a form of coercive control or coercion in a specific religious setting that in particular involves a misuse of spiritual authority. So this will typically be from a spiritual or religious leader of some kind. And spiritual abuse results when individuals are essentially deceived or manipulated in ways that causes detrimental changes to that person, the kind of harms that we were looking at there already. And it's specifically acute spiritual abuse when it harms core elements of the self, including the person's relationship to God, their religious and philosophical beliefs, issues to do with self-determination and the ability to think independently. But that's the relationship to God and those kind of existential beliefs is also at the core of spiritual abuse. And Lisa Oakley's definition here is also really important because she writes about the way in which at the heart of spiritual abuse is the exercise of power through coercion and control. And this is where these rules, the need for obedience, the manipulation of members is fundamentally coercive with those negative psychological effects that I was defining early on. I just want to give one very quick example of a historic organization that operated, but until relatively recently in the 1990s, I can give more contemporary examples if people are interested, but with the Magdalene laundries, there were numerous inquiries into the way in which young girls, young women were handed over by their families to the Magdalene laundries, worked in slavery conditions, either in the laundries or in the sewing shops. Many of them died there. In Ireland, they found a mass grave, for example, in 1993. Numerous other countries as well, where graves and other remains were found. There's been numerous government inquiries, including in Ireland and in those other jurisdictions. But we can see here that the different definitions of coercive control, in this case, the thought reform definition, can definitely apply to the way in which, and has been applied from testimony and government inquiries, to these examples, like with the Magdalene laundries, where you've got these high levels of control built around the notion of obedience, that if you don't do that, it's all about sin. So the language is loaded. There's a demand for purity, loyalty to the nuns in that case. The confession of sins, that's why they were there. They were seen as fallen women. That was how they were referred to and thought about. The total power of the nuns in that context, the work is everything. And the person is then dehumanized and fundamentally controlled in that setting. We can also see how Biderman's framework of coercion applies to a spiritually abusive setting like the Magdalene laundries as well. Total isolation, the person's thoughts being totally dominated, worn out by the work, threats and punishments, and what can be done? The women were in a terrible situation where they felt that they were unworthy, they needed redemption. But actually, it's wonderful to hear some of the survivors speak about how when they left this harmful milieu, they were able to recreate their lives again. And it's just sad, of course, and tragic that they experienced this abuse in the first place. So I'm making the case and outlining what may seem obvious to some of you, but needs, I think, more wider acknowledgement that coercive control, harmful forms of psychological and physical abuse occur in religious organisations. And that what do we need to do? And what is indeed already being done? And what we need is research on coercive control across settings, including religious groups, to understand the extent of the coercion and harm. That's one reason why we launched the master's program at Salford back in 2017. And there's been some great research from students and alumni from that program, as there have been in other universities like with the centre at Leeds and elsewhere, Chester I mentioned, as well as in other countries. And that research needs to keep going because it's that research that will inform the remedies and interventions that then can hopefully be formulated. Two quotes. The former executive director of ICSA, Michael Langoni, said, "Some groups under some circumstances harm some people." That's where we need research evidence to be rigorous. We should be making generalizations. And Herb Rosedale, the late president of AFF ICSA, said judgment should rest on careful analyses of structure and behavior within a specific context rather than a superficial classification. That's where we have to recognize that there's research on lots of overlapping terms. I won't go through all of these. I've talked about most of them already today, but this is where we need to almost bring those terms together, analyze them, see about the similarities and the differences. That's partly, again, what we do in the ICSA Research Network seminars. And we also need to recognize that there are a whole host of terms, sorry about that, that cover the experiences that people have. When we talk to survivors, when we measure survivor responses, they will use these terms, and we need to be respectful of the fact that these are the terms and these are the experiences that people have had, and we need to understand those experiences better so that we can come up with the remedies. So we need more research, and we need greater government and community oversight and tailored interventions. But I want to make a couple of points in closing: that we need for there to be an active dialogue with religious groups and communities to establish how coercion and abuse can be stopped and prevented. In other words, and this was one of the things that the Bloom Review aimed to do, would be to increase that dialogue and to say that, like any other organization, whether it be a workplace, a school, a hospital, there should be zero tolerance towards forms of coercive control and abuse. That we either need new laws, although I'm always inherently suspicious of needing more and more laws, or an extension of existing laws. And I've been advocating for years that the Health and Safety at Work Act could easily be extended by regulation to cover congregants and volunteers in religious settings, to people in political groups or movements, to give them the same protection that workers have, that employees have in the workplace. And fundamentally, of course, that religious or political beliefs, despite the fact that they are protected under laws, should not be a protection for perpetrators of abuse. Perpetrators should be brought to justice wherever they act. And therefore, it's important to identify where abuse and coercion is happening and to root it out. And that religions only get stronger when they're nurturing and empowering. In other words, the antithesis of coercive control. So I come to this topic as someone that actually wants religion to do better, I have religious beliefs of my own, so I don't come to this, although I respect people that are atheists or humanists, but that's not the perspective I have. The perspective I come from is to ensure that we can come together to ensure that coercive control is rooted out, that we understand it better, that interventions can be tailored to make a difference. Recognizing that some groups, of course, are led by psychopathic, sociopathic individuals where the harm is manifest throughout, other groups not to the same extent, and that we need different tools to deal with those different situations. But make no mistake, as with the cult next door, the Avarindam Balakrishnan group, which was a toxic mixture of religiosity, politics, and family abuse, coercive control in religions is part of our society. And I hope by speaking about it today with you all here that we can work together to make sure it becomes ultimately a thing of the past. And thank you very much again for giving me the opportunity to talk about this difficult but really important subject. So thank you, Alan, and everyone.
Thank you so much,